Hi everybody, it's me, Mr. Olson again, and here we are doing a new section called Plant Parts and Processes. I thought I'd start off this time with a bell ringer. Go ahead and ask yourself these questions. What parts of plants can you name? What processes occur in plants? Can you name 3 of each of those? That means 3 processes and 3 parts. And do you know how those parts relate to each process? Try to answer those on your own piece of paper or in your head, wherever, and just see what you know now, and then we'll check this again at the end of the presentation to see if you've actually learned anything. So this section is going to be called Plant Parts and Processes. It's going to be a mix of chapters 20 through 22. I know that's a lot. Don't freak out. We're only going to pick and choose some important topics from each of those different chapters, and I think we're gonna kind of get the all-star cast of plants. So we'll see how that works out. So here's some basic ideas about plants. We should be fairly familiar with it. First off, plants are photosynthesis machines. They are very efficient in turning solar light, sunlight, into chemical energy, which you know as sugars. We previously learned the phrase that was called carbohydrates. They're just the macromolecules that actually support what sugars actually are. Later, you're going to see that all plants and animals are actually very closely related by using the same products and reactants. That's going to be a process called cellular respiration. For right now, we're just still depending on our knowledge of photosynthesis, which was the last section. If you don't remember much from it, basically you just got to know plants take in carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight, and with that they create sugar and they create oxygen gas, which is the same stuff we breathe and eat. So let's move on and talk about it. So the one thing you should know right from the beginning, you already know this is just a review. Basically, plants have 3 basic organs. They have their roots, they have their stems, and they have their leaves. Now, roots are kind of obvious. They soak up water and minerals from the ground, but they also do a really good job on anchoring the plant. Imagine a giant oak tree. We have those all over the place here in Florida. And if you can actually look through the ground and see the roots, you'll see how widespread they are. Because the oak trees are so heavy up top, they got to have a lot of mass down below that actually sticks to that soil so it doesn't pull itself up in a pretty good thunderstorm. Sometimes, if the tree is in bad shape, the roots will die off, but the big massive tree is stuck up top, and that's why they blow over in storms. So keep an eye on trees if you live near any. The other thing is stems that really serve as the bulk of the plant. Their job is they support the leaves so they can grow out and reach out to more sun, but also they do a good job on help keeping fruits and flowers off the ground so they can get more of an aerial dispersion later on. And leaves are pretty obvious. Plants use leaves because they contain most of the photosynthetic cells, which means they have chloroplasts, and this is where photosynthesis generally occurs. So most everything is really supporting the leaves. That's really why everything's there. Now there are 5 processes in plants that you got to know about. The first one is going to be photosynthesis. I want you to really take notice of photosynthesis here because I've kind of summarized it for you in saying that cells store light into sugar. Basically, they take that energy from light and CO2 and water, and they turn that into sugar, which is really important for the plants because they break that down later in a process called cell respiration. Now, cell respiration is basically a process that turns sugar into energy. We use this process too, but a lot of the times kids forget to notice this. Cell respiration does take place in plants. They have their own mitochondria, and that's where it takes place. We will be spending a lot more time talking about this in a lot more detail in the next section. Transpiration is the next process that can occur in plants. This is when the cells inside of plants are actually moving around the oxygen gas, the CO2 gas, even water as a gas in and out of the plant. And then we see growth happening in plants. That's pretty obvious because they're an organism and organisms love to grow. And the other thing all organisms love to do is reproduce. And this is when cells make more cells. That's pretty obvious. You do all of these processes as well, but our form of transpiration only focuses on certain gases, and the only one that you don't really do is photosynthesis. You don't really do that, but plants do. So they're actually doing more than you are. How crazy is that? Now, all of the organs we're about to talk about relate directly to one or more of these processes, so try to keep in mind what processes are being used and what parts are being used for those processes. So there are 4 plant tissues I want you to be familiar with. The 4 are going to be dermal tissue, ground tissue, vascular tissue, and meristematic tissue. All of those might sound a little strange or difficult to follow, but trust me, you can do this. It's not too bad. Dermal tissue, that's the tissue that's found on the outer layer of cells, really on the outside of a plant's leaf, and its job is to protect the plant. Actually, most of plants have this cuticle, which is like this waxy layer, and then we have this epidural layer, which is basically epidermal layer, sorry. The epidermal layer is going to be the layer that really just acts like the skin. You have a skin, and we call it a dermal layer. You've probably heard of your epidermis. That is, part of your skin, and plants have something very similar. The next tissue, ground tissue, actually doesn't have anything to do with the ground. That's actually one thing that throws people off. It's not the tissue that's found underground. It's actually the tissue that is taking up most of the interior of a plant's leaf, or really just the inside of leaves. Its job is to store materials, usually sugars, sometimes oxygen, carbon dioxide. It's got little pockets built into it, so things can kind of get saved up and used appropriately. Vascular tissue is going to be kind of just like what we were talking about with dermal tissue. It's going to be another kind of tissue that helps move things around inside of plants. We have vascular tissue. It's very similar to what we have. Instead of having arteries and veins, though, they have veins that are made up of something called xylem and phloem. Fun words to look at, fun words to say. But it's really, its main purpose is that it transports water and sugars around inside of the plant. And we'll get into more detail here in just a little bit about that. And the last kind of tissue is something called meristematic tissue. Meristematic tissue is going to be the kind that is actually used for reproduction and growth inside of the plants. This is really, really found in the roots of plants. Of course, plants grow kind of everywhere, but most of their growth and some of their fastest growth happens to occur in their roots. I'm going to take a focus right now on the dermal tissue, which we just kind of mentioned. And remember, that's the outside layer of cells on the plants and leaves. But there are special epidermal cells that we need to be aware of, and if you were in class and you did the packet that we worked on last time, it actually talked about the guard cells. They're basically they're specialized cells that surround these holes in leaves, and those holes are called stomata, or a stoma, if we're talking about singular, and this is where gas exchange occurs. So this relates directly to transpiration. The gases are water loss, so that's H2O. The CO2 is getting brought into the plant, and the O2 is being released, and that's the process of transpiration. And I'll show you that to you in here in a little bit. So let's take a look at these layers. This, once again, should be kind of familiar to you if you did that packet we most recently did in class. Everything on the right side over here, we should see those really familiar organelles that we all learned about: chloroplast, vacuole, nucleus, cell wall, and cytoplasm. All of those are parts inside of these cells, and they should be part of all these cells. Just try to keep that in mind as we move forward. The very top layer that we see in this plant is going to be the cuticle. Now, this isn't actually a cell. This is just a waxy layer. It kind of protects the plant in a nice way because it makes it more waterproof. And it also helps protect it against just sun. It really stops those cells from receiving direct damage, which is a good thing for them. They're outside all the time. The dermal layer is pretty thin, and it's just like your skin, so those cells are very flat, very wide. They take up a wide surface area, and this is good. Then we see the ground tissue. The ground tissue is, once again, most of the space inside of the leaf of a cell. And if you look here, this cell is generally about 4 to 5 cells thick, and that's what most leaves are. They're not terribly thick. And remember how small cells actually are. So this is kind of a big deal. You can see down here on the bottom when we were talking about those very specialized cells. They're called guard cells and stoma. Those guard cells and stoma are going to be really important for moving gases and water in and out of plants. Now, I've been a little bit more particular here. It's the same image, but now you get to hear some of those phrases. And once again, in the packet that you worked on, this should look fairly familiar. We see the cuticle layer. We also see the upper epidermis. Okay, so dermal layer. By the way, epi, I gave you a little note up here that means over or on. So this really is telling you that it's really the layer over most of the leaf. And then we see the mesophyll. The meso, actually translating meso, it means middle. So this is the kinds of cells that we find in the middle of the leaf. And we can see there's two different kinds of mesophyll. There's the palisade and there's the spongy. Spongy is more spaced out and it has air pockets, and those will play a role in transpiration. And then we see the lower epidermis and the cuticle, and those are directly related to protecting the cell, once again, or rather the whole plant. This image here does a really good job on showing us exactly what a guard cell and stoma look like from the bottom of a leaf. And by the way, most of the time they do appear on the bottom of leaves. You can see the guard cells actually surrounds the hole, the opening in the middle. Here are the guard cells. There's two of them there. And then you can see that gap in the middle. That gap in the middle is actually called a stoma. Now, you've seen stomas or heard about stomas. They're just openings. If you've ever heard of somebody or seen somebody, especially in those public service announcements where it's trying to stop you from having that desire to smoke cigarettes, it shows you a woman who has a hole in her throat, and it's actually referenced as a stoma. It just means an opening, a hole. Now, these dark spots that we find in here are actually going to be the nuclei of all these different kinds of cells. That means that they are individual cells. They have their own DNA and they have very specialized jobs. And then you can see some of these extra cells that are kind of subsidiary, which just means they support the other cells that are there, and they're kind of like the extra stuff surrounding it. Dermal layer. Here we can see three layers that I think we should be very well aware of what they actually look like. The very first thing I want you to notice is this region right here. It's called the vascular tissue. The vascular tissue is actually the veins that we see inside of leaves. So if you look to the left here, I'm highlighting where those veins are. Those veins are made up of xylem and phloem. Now we'll define exactly what xylem and phloem do here in just a few minutes, but I just want you to be aware that's actually what the vascular tissue is. Then we have this wide section right here. That's going to be called the ground tissue. It's, once again, not in the ground necessarily. It just means that it's taking up a lot of the space inside of plants. And then this outer layer, which we call the dermal layer, this means it's the outside skin. It's literally the skin of the plant, and it helps protect it. I should also mention to you, there's this region around here that I'm kind of highlighting. This region right here is going to be what we call the cambrium. It's just kind of an area that separates the xylem and phloem from the ground tissue. It's a nice dividing line, and it really helps us see some different stuff. And the cambrium really is just a divider. This diagram here just shows a little bit what we've already seen before, but I just wanted to point out to you, sometimes you can have stoma on the top of a plant and on the bottom of the plant. Most of the time it's on the bottom. You can see that gas exchange occurring, and it makes more sense for it to be up here, or rather below, because that space, that mesophyll that has all of those air pockets, is going to really allow for CO2 and oxygen to be stored up. Also, water can be stored up in here, and it really makes sense. And if we look here, I like this diagram because it helps us highlight exactly what those veins look like. I already mentioned to you in the last diagram, each leaf has a vein that kind of runs through the middle and have little branching veins. Well, this actually shows you how basically we have this bundle of fibers, and those fibers are going to be either xylem or phloem, and they kind of go along with that entire length of vein. This is actually what they look like. I found an image of a microscope slide that shows these different layers in real life. You can see how tightly shaped the cells are inside of the vein. That shows us the xylem and the phloem. We'll take a closer look at that a little bit later on. You can see the guard cell down here on the bottom. That's going to be basically allowing that gas exchange to happen. You can see the small pockets surrounding that inside of the ground tissue. You can also see these little hairs. They're called trichomes. If you've ever seen a little tiny hair appearing on a plant, they are actually called trichomes, and Those are basically found usually on the bottom of a leaf, but they can actually appear on the side of the stem. And if you've ever noticed a plant having little fuzz on it, that's exactly what it is. Roots are an interesting tissue because they have actually way more parts than you'd consider. There's an end part to a root, which is called the root cap. There's also these little hairs that come off of them, kind of like the trichomes, but they're now underground. They're very small hairs that come off the root, and their job is to actually increase surface area, which increases water intake. So that's a good thing. And then we have these two different kinds of tissue here, which we already saw previously, called xylem and phloem. Now, the purpose of the xylem is that it carries water and dissolved minerals up from the roots. So really, their job is to bring stuff up and into the plant. We know water is very important. We know some minerals are very important. And this is basically why fertilizers work so well, because they really fill up inside of that xylem and bring that stuff inside of the leaves. And then the phloem, it carries products of photosynthesis around in the cell, namely sugar, so C6H12O6, your best friend, your tastiest best friend, that gives you energy as well, also gives plants their energy. Here's a basic diagram of what we see inside of a root. You can see there's this vascular cylinder, which basically means it's filled with vascular tissue. And we can see that it does contain both xylem and phloem. They do take some kind of interesting patterns, just the same way that your arteries and veins take very interesting patterns. On the outside, you can see the individual root hairs that are just kind of sticking out just a little bit from the surface of the root. And once again, they bring in a lot more kinds of water and minerals. And this whole region is called the zone of differentiation. You don't have to know that, but I just want you to know this is where we see a lot of different kinds of tissue inside of the roots. But as we go down towards the growing end of the roots, we call it the zone of elongation, and that's basically where it's going to grow longer. And there's phrase down here. We can see the very tip of the plant is called the root cap. And then you can see the special word down here called the meristem, which is where we find the meristematic tissue. Oh, that funny word that we talked about a while ago. Let's see if we can learn a little bit more about that too. I've kind of found a very detailed image of what the inside of roots look like. You can see how many cells are actually contained in there. Just in this photo alone, there's thousands and thousands of cells, and you can see basically working from the outside in, you can see you have your epidermis, so it's like the skin again, and then you can move inside, you find a lot of that ground tissue, and there's some phrases here that we don't have to worry about, but I do want you to recognize the phloem, that's the blue colored cells that you see here, and the xylem, that's the red covered cells. That look at the spacing in the red cells there. That's going to be the xylem, and that's going to allow for water to flow. You'll probably remember when we talked about capillary action that's found when water likes to bond to water and yet travels up different materials. That's why these are so wide, so more water can fit through there. And plants love water, so they always demand it. They always need it. The blue tissues are really going to be where we start moving around products of photosynthesis, which basically means a lot of sugars and some oxygen are going to be moved around. On the right side, you can see an image of xylem and phloem actually stained, so you can see them in different colors, and that's a real image from a real microscope that shows you the detail of what they are. And on the right side, you can actually see a little bit more of how some of those materials move in and out of the roots. You don't have to memorize the order that layers go through here, but you do have to recognize those basic parts that I mentioned before. Root cap, you're going to have to know the root hairs, and you'll have to know xylem and phloem. Those are the main ideas you have to know. If I move down a little bit further on this image, which is gigantic, you can see another close, very close zoomed in region of the bottom of the roots. The very bottom region here, we see something called the ground meristem. I'm going to highlight that for you right here. That's going to be the region where we see cell division taking place. This is called mitosis. This is where the plant is doing most of its growth. So this is where the newest cells are going to be found. A really good plant to use to find these are actually onion root tips. Basically, any onion that grows in your house or in your kitchen or outside, if you could look at their roots grow over a period of just a couple days, you'll see they will definitely increase in just one small region, and you'll reach outward. And that root cap stays pretty solid. Its job is to really help push through that point. It's designed to push through soil and dirt. So let's go ahead and talk about sex, or at least the sex inside of plants. We will talk about animal sexual anatomy and physiology a little bit later on in the year. Actually, that'll be one of the last topics we get to, but this will be a good introduction because it relates to photosynthesis as well as a little bit of sexual reproduction. Plants are very, very, very different than us in this regard. They have some of the basic parts, but they don't look the same way ours do. If we look, we see this phrase called stamen. The stamen is the male sexual organ. That should be easy to remember because you see men is in the title of stamen. How about that? That's good. By the way, this symbol here means male. So if you've ever seen that before, that's kind of one that's thrown around. It's made up of two parts. One's called the filament and one's called the anther. We'll talk about those in detail in a minute. Then we have the pistil. It's also called the carpel by some people. I'm not sure which one is a more current term. Carpel, pistil, it's all the same. But I like to remember, this is really dumb, so don't judge me. This is the female part of the plant because my grandmother used to say about a woman who was very, very energetic and sassy, she would call her a real pistil. I don't know why. I'm just giving you some tools. Anyway, the pistil is made up of three main parts called the stigma, the style, and the ovary. Ovary should sound very familiar to you because women who are, female humans have ovaries. All female mammals have ovaries. And also style, which is also true that most females seem to have style. Ha ha ha. Sorry, guys. Then there's also an egg that's contained within the ovary. Eventually, this can become the seed. And if you really start to think about it, if you eat a fruit, you're eating an ovary and seed of another organism, which sounds super gross. And then there's this thing called a sepal, which supports the petals. It's kind of green, and petals, as you know, are the pretty part of a flower, and they're designed to attract pollinators or insects that really come by and move around pollen. This diagram here does an excellent job on showing us exactly what those parts are, and we were keeping it as simple as possible. And I know at this point you're probably saying, Mr. Olson, there's already so much stuff you showed me. Don't show me anymore. But we got to. I'm sorry. You got to do it. Anyway, so we can see the stamen in the upper left-hand corner. That's the anther and filament. The filament is a long tube that actually stretches out from the center of the flower, and the anther is basically the very top of that tube that contains all the pollen. Pollen is basically the sperm of flowers. I know, it's a bad analogy, but that's exactly what it is. And then we can look over here. We can see the carpel, also known as the pistil. That's going to be the stigma, the style, and the ovary. The ovary is really important, and it's protected. That's why it's kind of in the central part of the flower. Makes it very, very nice to keep it safe. And you can see down here, we can see the petals, we can see the sepals, and we can see a receptacle. You don't have to know receptacle, but you should basically know that's where it's attached to the stem of the plant. Now, I've spent some time trying to separate these things here and make it simple for you, but the female part and the male part are separated here. You can see you have the pistil, also known as the carpel. Both phrases, by the way, are totally interchangeable. I don't care which one you remember, as long as you remember they both mean the same thing. And then you see the male part on the right side, the female on the left side. I tried to give you a small diagram reminding you kind of what they look like. The stigma is the sticky part of the carpel that allows pollen to attach. Basically, it's the very top of the female part, and it has a very unique shape that allows pollen to stick to it very nicely. Actually, sometimes if you play with flowers, you'll notice the very tips of those can be quite sticky, and that helps absorb pollen and move it inside of the plant. The style is just the tube that kind of delivers the pollen down to the ovary. It can be used a little bit later on in some fruits as like a protective layer, and we'll probably talk about that in just a few slides. And then the ovary, once again, this is where the future seeds of plant are stored, and they must be united with the pollen here. Basically, the style serves as the fallopian tube, and the ovary acts as the ovary that we find that produces eggs inside of female mammals. Then on the male side, we once again know that is the stamen. Don't forget, men means male. The anther is going to be the region where the pollen is actually held. It stays on the outside. Some plants decide to use wind. Some plants decide to use animals to help move that pollen around. But you can see the basic shape is really two ovular shapes, and the pollen kind of builds up on the outside. And then we see the filament here, and it's just the tube that extends from the center part of the plant. It basically stretches out further. The more further away it's actually sticking out, the more likely it is trying to brush up against something, maybe the wind or maybe another animal. Also, by the way, I should make a note here. Pollen kind of comes in two forms. There's big chunky versions and very light versions, very fine powdery versions. The finer powder version is really used in wind, in actually using wind to transport it, and the big chunky parts are really designed to help animals pick up on them and move them around. There's a lot of pollens out there that you can't see, but they usually make you have an allergic reaction to them. And the big chunky ones, there's the ones that you can see right on the flower. They'll kind of get on your clothing or your fingertips. Those are the ones that usually stick to animals, and you are walking proof that they can stick to you just by their shape. So I want to show you just a little bit about how that pollen moves inside of the plants. We can see the basic parts here. We've already reviewed that. And we can see the anther contains all those individual pollen grains. Well, those pollen grains, by one way or another, will move across and actually touch to the stigma. This means that the flower can self-reproduce, so it can be asexual to a degree. It actually reproduces with only itself. Sometimes that pollen can get transferred to a whole different flower that's of the same species, of course, and actually cross-pollinate. But the pollen will stick to the top, and then it'll travel down these pollen tubes, and then the sperm nuclei will come off of that pollen and actually reach the different eggs contained within the ovary. Those eggs will eventually develop into a zygote, and then an embryo, and then the embryo will basically be the seed. And that seed can take care of itself because it's got its own little food source in there. It's got its own amount of proteins and everything it needs to survive, and carbohydrates for food, of course. And then it can germinate into actually creating another plant, which is pretty amazing stuff. This shows you pretty much the same process, but it mentions a few phrases. You don't have to know this whole thing, guys, so don't freak out. Basically, it shows you on the right side the male process, and on the left side the female process. I want you to recognize, guys, that the anther contains those pollens, and they have to go through a growth process, and then they go through another process before they can finally become mature enough to actually do any good. Same thing's true on the left side. The ovary has to develop to a point where it's mature enough to be able to handle the sperm so they can actually become fertilized and then in turn make a seed. Now, different plants work in different ways, but most flowering plants produce seeds that can actually spill out and fall into the ground or maybe get carried by the wind, and they can go and disperse themselves in a different pattern so they're not competing with their own parents when they finally grow, which is a very smart thing to do. These are the different shapes that pollen can take. You can see that there's a lot of different spiky images on there, and they actually help pollen stick to many different surfaces, namely the stigma of a flower, but I also want to mention that helps them stick to other surfaces like fur of animals or hairs of animals, and sometimes even your own clothing. This flower here takes some pretty extreme measures to help the anther get as far away from the flower as we can get. The filaments are very long, and their job is to pull it away from the plant so that the wind won't be blocked by the petals. This means that this pollen is probably transported via the wind. So let's go ahead and talk about some different kinds of flowering or really different kinds of plants in general. There's really two forms you got to be aware of: angiosperms and gymnosperms. Angiosperms are the ones that you see with seeds and fruits. So the seeds are contained within the fruit, like an apple, and we'll talk about this a little bit later on. But how is this different than a gymnosperm? You know gymnosperms because they're the ones that are basically cones, like a pine tree. Their job is they produce these cones, which are actually filled with ripened seeds, and they spill out onto the ground and actually protect the seeds for a while as they fall. Here you can see that we have the different parts of a flower. In the upper right-hand corner, there's the classic flower that we're familiar with. You can see the female parts, you can see the male parts, but down below that you can see what kind of seed and what kind of fruit they actually make. For example, an apple actually shows you like the little remains of the stamen and the style that are actually contained what you think is the bottom of the apple, but the truth is that's actually the top. That's where the top of the flower actually was. The middle part that's swollen up, that's called the receptacle, is actually the region that contains most of the carbohydrates, so eventually the seeds have more food to feed off of while they germinate, and the seeds are contained within the middle. The small part that stops or really reaches out from the very top of the apple, what you might call the top of the apple, is really going to be the stem, the remaining stem that connected the flower to the actual rest of the plant. On the left side, you can see there's different kinds of flowers. This is called a inflorescence kind of flower. Each little segment actually develops from the carpel of one flower, and that's kind of why they remain there. They're kind of pointy, and it really helps prevent predators from maybe jumping in there too much. This image shows another kind of fruiting pattern that we see. I was a little bit more surprised that even I learned this. I didn't realize it. Maybe I learned it previously, but I don't remember. In the right-hand side, we can see there's raspberries. Raspberries have many different kinds of stamen, many different ovaries, and they basically have many different flowers that reproduce and make what you know is a berry fruit here. And on the left side, we can see we have a pea. Plant. We're going to study these a little bit later on when we come to genetics, but you can see that the leftover remains of the ovule and the ovary are going to be contained within the outside, which is actually the leftover stigma, or really the pollinating tube. It kind of stretches out, and we have our different individual seeds in there, which we know as peas.
Imagine a pine cone.
Pine cones are actually made of two different kinds of cones. There's a seed cone and a pollen cone. You've probably thought that they're really the same thing, like maybe a pollen cone is just a baby version of a seed cone, but the truth is they're two totally different things. The pollen cones generate pollen, of course. They're basically the male part of the pine tree, and then the seed cones are basically the female part of the tree. So hopefully you learned something new there. This diagram here shows us pretty nicely of that process. Once again, guys, you don't have to memorize all of this. I just want you to see the different processes that ovulating cones or actual pine cones and pollen cones actually go through. You can see basically that the sperm have to reach the egg, and they stick to the middle part of the inside of a cone. When this happens, we actually create these small little leaves. I remember when I was a little kid, my parents would call them helicopter leaves because they actually take a shape where they kind of twirl like a helicopter blade and fall down. They'll eventually kind of germinate a little bit and fit themselves into the ground so they can produce another mature tree, which we call a sporophyte. So we've done it. We've made it to the end, and your gift is a nice review. I know, I'm so nice. Well, basically, what we've covered is that plants have a lot of different functions. We've talked about cell respiration, photosynthesis, transpiration, and some things that, all living things do is reproduction and growth. And those 5 things tell you what plant processes are actually occurring. They're made up of 4 different kinds of tissue. Plants are made of dermal tissue, vascular tissue, ground tissue, and meristematic tissue. Remember, meristematic is used for growth. Ground tissue is making up just a bulk of the plant. Vascular tissue helps move things around in the plant, and dermal is going to be used for protecting the outside of the plant. There's 3 main parts to plants. There's the stem, which just connects all the leaves together. There's leaves, which really perform all the photosynthesis, and roots, which help in moving materials around and giving resources to the leaves so they can work properly. The next thing is that those roots have particular parts. We talked about the root cap, the very tip of the roots. There's xylem and phloem, which takes up a good space on the inside and actually moves materials around. The outside layer of those roots have root hairs. There's also regions that are really focused on growth. Real cell division is occurring there. Reproduction, that's going to be the meristem. And the last thing is the cambrium. That's going to be the area where we separate the xylem and the phloem from the ground tissue of plants. And plant sexual anatomy was a big part of this too. We have the male and female parts. We said the female comes in not 2 parts, but 2 different names. We can call it the pistil or the carpel. We know we have something called a stigma. That's where the pollen sticks to. Then it travels down something called the style, which is basically the tube that connects to the ovary, and the ovary is the very last part there. And the male part is going to be what we call the stamen. That's easy to remember because it has men in the title, and is made up of two parts called the filament and the anther. The filament's just a long tube that supports the anthers away from the bulk of the plant, and the anther is actually going to contain the pollen, so it can actually move around. We also talked about some of the differences between angiosperms and gymnosperms. I'm really only going to test you on angiosperms. I think your EOC will only test you on angiosperms. And basically, those are the plants that develop flowers and can develop fruits as a result of that. We talked about some different ways fruits can form. We talked about that life cycle, how they actually make those fruits, and that's how, really, we turn pollen into, a delicious apple. So, after knowing all this stuff and after reviewing all this stuff, do you know what all these things do? If you really don't, you can feel free to flip back to any of the previous slides, listen to me blab on again. Hopefully you were paying attention in class, maybe took some notes. You can check those as well. And maybe some of the future assignments we do will help you remember some stuff here. I want you guys to master this stuff. And the best way to do that is to keep putting it in front of you. Keep learning, keep trying, keep using it. If you really want to check yourself on your understanding, you can do yourself a favor, flip back to the very first slide of this presentation that we called the bell ringer, and try to answer those questions. And I'm sure, especially after listening to this, you should be able to go back there and name at least 3 plant parts and 3 different processes and how those plant parts are used for those processes. I feel like you guys will be able to do a really good job on that. And the other cool thing is, I'm telling you, if you can answer those questions and handle that, you should be able to handle any quiz or test questions that I throw your way. Feel free to let me know if this was a good or a bad experience for you. Let me know if it worked. And other than that, I hope you have a great day and keep learning some bio.